Remove that fake item from around your neck. Now. The order fell cold and final enough to turn a human being into an object of judgment in a single instant. The man standing before the bench did not argue. He did not beg. He stood straight, his arms resting naturally at his sides, a posture shaped by a lifetime of receiving orders rather than defending himself. When they said this was not a stage for playing soldier, he remained silent. Not because he had nothing to say, but because there are things that become more humiliating the more you try to explain them. The chain beneath his worn collar pressed against his skin heavier than every accusation that had just been spoken. To them, it was nothing more than a fake trinket, a cheap trick worn by a homeless man. But he knew exactly what he was carrying. He had stood in rain and sand in places where orders were not meant to be debated, only survived. When the command was repeated sharper and more final, he slowly lifted his head. His eyes did not plead. They did not defy. They said only one thing: power can force a man to remove an object, but it cannot command dignity to disappear. And in that moment of silence, dense, unyielding, that quiet began to shake the entire room. If you believe that true courage is not found in the sound of gunfire, but in the silence of those who have walked through war, please like this video, share this story, and subscribe to Service Honor Stories, so together we can preserve the memory, dignity, and reverence owed to our quiet heroes. Daniel said nothing. He stood straight, his back tightening slightly, a reflex etched deep into his body after years of obeying orders. It was not the posture of a man begging, nor the stance of someone resisting. It was the bearing of a man accustomed to being called forward, accustomed to standing before authority, accustomed to waiting for judgment without losing himself. In that moment, the entire room seemed to slow because his silence was not empty. It carried weight. Daniel's calloused hand lightly touched the chain beneath his collar. Not to show it, not to protect it. Just a gentle touch, as if to check that the familiar thing was still there. Fingers that had once gripped straps, that had once pulled comrades out of gunfire, now needed only that touch to remind him who he was. No one clearly saw the gesture, yet its restraint spoke louder than any defense he could have offered. He stared straight ahead. His eyes did not beg. They did not burn with anger. They were the eyes of someone who had learned how to stay calm when everything around him tried to force him into a corner. Some trials do not require long accusations. They need only a label. Daniel was used to that. Used to being seen as a number in a file, a typical case, a burden to be resolved quickly. His silence was not acceptance, it was the last form of self-command he still possessed. Beside him, Laura Mendez tilted her head slightly. Her gaze passed over Daniel, then lingered, uncertain. She was young, her face still carrying faith in procedure, and in what was supposed to be right. But in that moment, that faith wavered. She wanted to say something, to ask a question, to stop the order that had just been given. Her lips pressed together, her hand tightening around the thin folder. Guilt was clear in her eyes. Guilt for arriving too late, for not understanding enough for the system she represented, having just trampled a human being. Daniel sensed her gaze. He did not turn. He didn't need to. He knew the feeling of someone torn between duty and conscience. He had seen it before on faces far younger than his own, in places where a delayed decision could cost lives. Now he chose silence so as not to force anyone else into a harder position. There was a very brief moment when the room held no sound at all. Not because people agreed, but because they did not know how to respond to such composure. Daniel's silence exposed an uncomfortable truth. There are people who have grown used to being judged without being heard, used to being ordered without being asked, used to standing at the very end of the line, where explanations are often considered unnecessary. He took a slow breath. No one heard it, but it was steady, controlled. It said he was still here, still conscious, still in command of himself. In his mind, there were no long defenses waiting to be spoken. Only one short thought remained: stand firm. Let the truth find its own way if it still has a way to travel. The silence stretched for another beat, and it was that beat that made the one holding power feel challenged. Not by words, but by Daniel's refusal to follow the familiar script of submission. In this moment, silence was no longer resignation. It became a mirror forcing others to confront their own posture. And when silence was no longer understood as obedience, it was immediately treated as defiance, an excuse for humiliation to escalate. Crowley's lips curled slightly, his gaze settling on Daniel's neck as if he had just spotted something that irritated him. He tilted his head, his voice stretching out, openly mocking. "Did you buy that at a military surplus store?" The question echoed without needing an answer. It was spoken to belittle to turn what the man was wearing into a public joke. Daniel did not react. He remained still, his eyes fixed forward as if the words had slid past him, without striking where they were meant to. Yet that very silence only made the man in power feel compelled to say more, to push further. Crowley tapped his finger lightly on the bench, his voice turning hard and clipped. "I didn't ask for your opinion. Take it off." The order was repeated this time, stripped of sarcasm, leaving only force. Around the room a few heads lifted, and then dropped again. There were furtive glances, brief frowns. Humiliation was no longer Daniel's alone. It began to spread, seeping into the shared silence. Daniel understood that moment with painful clarity. He knew when an order stopped being about the law, when it was being used to prove who stood above and who stood below. He inhaled slowly and deeply, not to prepare a defiance, but to keep himself from being pulled under by anger. Over the years, he had learned that some battles cannot be won with words, and that sometimes obeying an order is the only way to expose its true nature. At the prosecution table, Rachel Moore lifted her eyes from the file. Her gaze rested on Daniel, then shifted to Crowley. Something was wrong. This was no longer about determining right or wrong in a minor offense. She sensed the tone in the room had changed. The words being spoken were not meant to clarify facts, but to assert personal dominance. Rachel pressed her lips together and set her pen down on the table. She said nothing, but her silence was different now. It was alert, watchful. Daniel dipped his head just enough for his hand to brush the chain beneath his collar. This time, the gesture was no longer a simple check. It was a decision. He raised his hand slowly, without haste, without reluctance. Every movement was deliberate, as if he wanted everyone to see that this was not fear. This was the choice of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Crowley watched him, a flicker of triumph passing through his eyes. He believed he had forced the other man to bow. In that instant, power seemed reaffirmed. But Daniel's deliberate slowness made the air grow heavy. No one laughed. No one exhaled in relief. The humiliation unfolded in public, bare and cold, no longer shielded by any legal pretense. Daniel lifted the chain over his head and held it in his palm. The metal touched his skin, cool and familiar. He did not look down. He stepped forward once and placed what he was holding onto the table before him. He did not throw it. He did not let it drop. He set it down carefully, the way one places a keepsake. The gesture made several people in the room instinctively hold their breath. Because even in humiliation, there was dignity. Crowley opened his mouth as if to say something more, then stopped. There was a subtle shift in the air difficult to name. Rachel Moore stared at the object that had just been placed on the table, and her eyes were no longer those of a detached prosecutor. They were the eyes of someone beginning to understand that a line had been crossed, not a legal one, but a human one. Daniel stepped back, returning to his place. His hands hung straight at his sides, empty. But that emptiness was not loss. It was the stillness before something irreversible takes hold. He lifted his head and looked straight ahead, not in challenge, not in pleading. He simply stood there, as he had so many times in his life, waiting for what would come next, with a calm that was almost frightening. And when Daniel accepted that order, the act that appeared to be submission became the very moment that opened the door to a truth no one in that room would ever be able to take back. Daniel held his posture for a brief beat, as if giving the room time to understand that what had just happened could not be undone. Then he stepped forward and placed the dog tags on the table. There was no hesitation, no wasted movement. Metal met wood with a short, dry sound, enough to erase every other noise. The room fell into a dense silence, the kind that appears only when someone has unknowingly crossed a boundary. Daniel stepped back half a pace. His empty hands dropped straight at his sides. He did not look down, nor did he look around. Everything that needed to be said now lay on the table. In that moment, the humiliation from before no longer belonged to him. It shifted quietly, unmistakably. Crowley looked down at the object before him. The earlier smile was gone. He seemed about to speak, but his throat suddenly went dry. The room did not wait for him. Attention slid away from familiar authority and settled on those two small pieces of metal. Mark Lewis, the bailiff standing near the door, shifted slightly. It was a small movement, almost reflexive. His gaze fixed on the table and could not pull away. Mark had once stood in formation, had once heard metal clink during early morning roll calls, had known exactly what that sound meant. He took a step forward, his voice quiet but firm. "Your Honor, may I see that?" No one answered at first. Crowley looked at Mark, then back down at the table. A reluctant nod followed. Mark reached out and lifted the tags. His manner was entirely different from what had preceded it. No haste, no curiosity, as if he were holding something that deserved respect. His thumb brushed the metal familiar in a way that surprised even him. Mark read the first line engraved. A name, a number, a blood type. His expression did not change, but at the next line he stopped. His eyes narrowed slightly. His jaw tightened. "That can't be right," he murmured as if speaking to himself. He turned the tags over and read again, slower this time. The unit code stood clear enough for anyone who had served to recognize instantly. Mark looked up. His eyes searched for Daniel. It was not the gaze of an officer performing a duty, but of one veteran recognizing another. You were with this unit," his voice grew hoarse at the last word. Daniel did not answer right away. He gave a barely perceptible nod. Not to confirm it for the room, but to return the look that had found him. Nothing more was needed. Mark took a deep breath. The hand holding the tags trembled slightly, not from fear. "I served in the Marine Corps," he said this time loud enough for everyone to hear. "I know this code. No one wears it without reason." He turned toward Crowley, his voice still disciplined, but something harder now lived beneath it. "Your Honor, this is not fake." Rachel Moore straightened. She looked from the dog tags to Daniel, then to Mark. The pieces began to fall into place. She realized she was facing something that could not be handled with the familiar language of case files. She set her pen down on the table, not out of hesitation, but because she understood that continuing would make her complicit in something wrong. Crowley opened his mouth, then closed it. Not because he lacked words, but because any words now carried danger. He scanned the room, searching for the usual agreement, and found none. The eyes in the room had shifted. No one spoke loudly. No one objected. But this silence was different from before. It no longer pressed down on Daniel. Mark placed the dog tags back on the table more carefully than Daniel himself had done. He stood straight, his hands coming together in front of him. "Your Honor," he said clearly. "Some things don't need to be spoken loudly to be known as true." Daniel remained still. He did not smile. He did not exhale in relief. He had done his part. What came next no longer belonged to him. In that room, the truth was not proclaimed by a gavel or a ruling. It was simply present, quietly powerful enough to unsettle positions that had once seemed unmovable. And when the truth had been recognized even before anyone dared to name it, the balance of power began to tilt toward another side slowly, but beyond reversal. Mark Lewis stood straight, his eyes no longer uncertain. He faced forward, his voice low and clear, strong enough for everyone in the room to hear. "This unit code is real. Ranger 75. He did not raise his voice. He did not emphasize the words. Yet they carried the weight of a confirmation no one could deny. Mark said nothing about heroics. He listed no missions. He did not need to. For those who had served, those 4 words were enough. Daniel remained still. He did not step forward, nor did he step back. When Mark finished speaking, Daniel lifted his head slightly, as if accepting that the truth had finally been set in its rightful place. He spoke slowly, his voice deep, carrying neither pride nor resentment. "They've been with me since Mogadishu, and from those who didn't come back. Just one sentence. No further explanation. No request to be understood." The words fell, and with them spread every memory they carried throughout the room. No one asked what Mogadishu was. No one demanded details. Those who had heard the name before knew what it was bound to. Those who had not could still sense that it was not a place for gentle retellings. Daniel was not speaking about himself. He was speaking of those who were no longer there, and that was precisely why his words could never be mistaken for boasting. The entire courtroom stood still. Not the tense silence from before, but something altogether different, a silence of recognition. Crowley looked down at the table, then over at Daniel. The familiar authority in his eyes faded, replaced by an unease he could not hide. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time, that position offered him no suitable words. Rachel Moore set her pen down on the table. The sound was small, but distinct. She looked directly at Daniel, then turned to Mark. In that moment, she no longer saw a defendant. She saw a man who had carried burdens the law in this room could not measure. The file before her grew thin, meaningless. For her, the case had ended right then. Daniel did not seize the moment. He did not step forward to say more. He did not seek sympathetic eyes. He stood as he was, as if everything that needed proving had proven itself. His hands still hung straight at his sides, empty, but that very emptiness only highlighted all that he had carried for so many years. Mark Lewis stepped back half a pace, returning to his place. Before turning away, he gave Daniel a slight nod. A nod so small only the two of them could see it. Not a greeting, not a formality, just acknowledgement between people who understood each other without long explanations. Crowley cleared his throat as if trying to reclaim control, but the air had already changed. The eyes in the room no longer looked to him for orders. They paused on Daniel, then quickly turned away, as if no one wished to intrude further. Power, for the first time that morning, began to withdraw. Not loudly, not with an announcement. It withdrew because it no longer had firm ground to stand on. Daniel felt the shift. He did not smile. He did not exhale in relief. For him, this was not a victory. It was simply the moment when honor was finally called by its proper name after far too long being forgotten. He turned his gaze forward and waited calmly for what would come next, the same way he had once waited for orders in places far more distant. And when honor was restored to its rightful place, the truth no longer stood alone. It began to compel those in power to face it and to answer for it. Rachel Moore stood upright. Her voice rang out clear, not loud, not trembling, but firm enough to cut through the last traces of hesitation in the room. Your Honor, the prosecution moves to dismiss all charges. The words were not spoken as a procedural formality, but as a carefully weighed moral choice. She continued each word precise. The defendant posed no danger, caused no damage, and acted without malicious intent. Prosecuting this case under these circumstances is unjust. Crowley looked up. He did not hide his surprise. What did you say? His voice snapped, trying to retain its familiar authority. Rachel did not step back. I was clear, Your Honor. Dismiss all charges. In that moment, she was no longer speaking as a rigid guardian of written law. She spoke as a human being who had just realized the line between right and wrong had been crossed. Mark Lewis stepped forward half a pace. Your Honor, he said, his voice low and steady. I confirm that Mr. Daniel Cross's service record is authentic. He did not look at Crowley, but straight ahead. I verified the unit code. Ranger 75, there is no mistake. The court reporter, Helen Brooks, stopped typing. She looked up, her eyes red but composed. I have recorded this, she said slowly, and I confirm that what has just been presented is accurate. Her voice was not loud, but it carried the authority of someone who had witnessed enough courtrooms to know when history was being rewritten. Daniel remained still as he had from the beginning. He did not insert himself into the exchange unfolding around him. When Rachel finished, when Mark and Helen spoke in turn, he merely gave a slight nod. Not to offer thanks and not to signal vindication. He stood like a man accustomed to the truth arriving late and knowing that when it does, it needs no help from him. In the back row, a young man raised his phone. He said nothing, only held it steady. No one had asked him to do so, but there are moments when people know that if they are not preserved, they will vanish forever. Daniel did not turn to look. He did not know and did not need to know that this moment was being recorded. Crowley cleared his throat. The court needs time to consider, he said, but his voice no longer sounded certain. He flipped through the file, then turned it back again as if searching for a line that might restore his control. There was nothing there. Everything that had just been spoken was too clear. For the first time that morning, Crowley had no immediate answer after opening his mouth. Your Honor, Rachel continued, not harshly, but allowing no escape, we cannot proceed as though nothing has happened. She paused briefly. This is no longer an ordinary case. Crowley looked at Daniel. The contempt was gone from his eyes, replaced by a mix of confusion and defensiveness. Do you have anything further to say? He asked, his voice far lower than before. Daniel gave a very slight shake of his head. No, Your Honor, he replied. Just 2 words. Nothing more. He had already said his part by standing still and by one single sentence about Mogadishu. The rest did not belong to him. The room fell silent once again. But this time it was not the silence of fear or suppression. It was the silence that follows a moral decision just declared. Crowley looked down at the table, then lifted his head. The court accepts the prosecution's motion, he said, his voice hard and brief. All charges are dismissed. Daniel took a slow breath. No one noticed, but it was different from before, not full relief, but lighter. He gave a small nod. He did not say thank you, For him, being treated justly required no gratitude. The man holding the phone lowered his hand, his eyes still fixed on Daniel. He knew he had just witnessed something that went far beyond a ruling. A moment when justice had spoken, but what it awakened was far greater. Because when the charges were dismissed, the story did not end. It had only just begun to spread beyond these walls, where the echo of truth would carry farther than any verdict ever could. The news spread faster than any clarification ever could. The video was shared, then shared again, carrying with it the image of a man standing motionless in a courtroom, and words that had moved far beyond the boundaries of a legal proceeding. Public reaction erupted. People argued, grew angry, questioned how power was used, and how human beings were treated when they had nothing left to prove except themselves. Daniel learned about it later through others' accounts. He did not seek the video out. He felt no need to revisit a moment he had already lived fully. "Do you know what's happening?" Mark Lewis asked when he caught up with Daniel in the hallway. His voice was low-edged with surprise and concern. "People are talking about you. Everywhere." Daniel looked at Mark, his expression calm. "I figured," he replied. There was no curiosity in his voice, no pride, only an acceptance that the story had already moved beyond his control. In the days that followed, decisions came quickly. Judge Crowley was suspended, then placed under investigation. His resignation notice appeared soon after, brief and cold. No lengthy explanation. No public defense. Daniel heard the news from Mark. He nodded as if acknowledging something that had long been inevitable. To him, it was not a victory. It was simply consequence. "You don't feel satisfied?" Mark asked, hesitating. He knew it might be an unnecessary question. Daniel shook his head. "No," he said. "I wasn't standing there waiting for someone to fall." Mark fell silent. He studied Daniel as if searching for a more familiar reaction. Anger, triumph, at least relief. There was none. Daniel leaned against the wall, his hands in the pockets of his worn jacket, his gaze fixed beyond what was unfolding around them. "You were humiliated," Mark said this time, dropping the official tone. "You had every right," Daniel interrupted him gently. "Rights don't always need to be used," he said. "Some things once used can't be taken back." Mark lowered his head as if realizing something too late. "I'm sorry," he said slowly, "for not seeing it sooner." Daniel turned toward him, his eyes settling on Mark's. "No blame, no irritation." "I don't need an apology," he said. "Just next time, look more closely." It was not forgiveness in the usual sense. It sounded more like a reminder given without weight. Mark nodded. He understood he had just accepted a responsibility not only for himself, but for all the times yet to come. Daniel left the courthouse without looking back. No statement, no interviews. He walked the way he always had for years, quietly leaving no noise behind. For him, what needed to be said had already been said through action and through silence at the right moment. Outside, people continued to argue, to judge, to retell the story in their own ways. Daniel did not join that conversation. He understood that if everything ended with one person being punished, the lesson would remain incomplete. What he wanted was not the collapse of an individual, but a change in how people chose to see one another. Mark watched Daniel's figure fade into the distance. He realized that some people do not come to reclaim justice for themselves alone. They come to set a higher standard for everyone who remains. And that was why the story could never end with a simple administrative decision. Daniel spoke no further to anyone. But in that silence, the message was clear: justice may conclude in a single day, but responsibility lasts far longer. It lives in the choice each person makes when holding even a small amount of power to truly see the human being standing in front of them. And as the door of justice closed, Daniel moved forward not to rest, but to carry a new role, quieter yet heavier, to safeguard what had just been remembered. Daniel received his small room on a quiet morning. The key rested neatly in his palm, heavy enough to remind him that it was real. Not a reward, not a privilege, just something he should have had long ago. The paperwork was completed efficiently. His veteran benefits were restored. Therapy sessions began on a steady schedule. No one asked whether he deserved it. This time, the system simply did what it was meant to do. He arranged the room with very few belongings: a neatly made bed, a small table, a wooden box placed in the corner. Daniel did not rush. Every movement was slow and deliberate, the habit of someone used to maintaining order in the middle of chaos. He opened the wooden box and placed the dog tags inside. The metal lay still, no longer touching his skin. He did not need to wear them anymore. He did not need to prove anything anymore. He knew who he was, and that was enough. Daniel did not stop there. In the days that followed, he returned to familiar places, not to relive the past, but to do what needed to be done. He carried blankets, water, information about shelters, about support programs that actually worked. He sat beside men and women who had once worn uniforms and were now learning how to survive one day at a time. He listened more than he spoke. When he spoke, it was brief. When silence was needed, he chose it at the right moment. "Where were you deployed?" someone asked. Daniel answered softly. "Far enough that when I came back, people didn't recognize me right away." No one laughed. No one asked more. They understood. One afternoon, he met Mark Lewis. The two stood side by side watching people pass by. Mark talked about the changes taking place, about meetings, about new guidelines. Daniel listened and nodded. "What matters," he said, "is that next time no one has to stand alone." "I remember," Mark replied. Daniel continued his therapy sessions. Some days were easier. Some were harder. He did not avoid them. He learned to name memories he had once let drift past unspoken. He learned to slow his breathing when his body reacted too quickly. Not to forget, but to keep living without being pulled backward. The counselors promised no miracles. They simply worked patiently. Daniel respected that. One evening, he opened the wooden box again. The dog tags lay beside an old photograph. Faces, much younger eyes, still filled with belief. Daniel touched the lid and closed it. He did not need to carry the past around his neck to keep moving forward. The past lived in the way he stood, the way he spoke, the way he looked at others. Someone asked why he did not tell his story more often. Daniel shook his head. "The story isn't mine," he said. "It belongs to those who still haven't been seen." He chose to walk with them, to point the way when needed, and to step back when that was enough. The changes continued to spread, quietly, without slogans. Just a few more lingering glances, a few better-timed questions, a few decisions made without haste. Daniel did not claim credit. He accepted responsibility. He said to a young man whose hands were shaking from the cold, "Stand up straight. Not so others can see you, so you can remember." The young man did. That was all. Night fell. Daniel placed the wooden box in the drawer. He turned off the light. The silence was no longer frightening. It was space wide enough for tomorrow to begin. Honor does not disappear when a person falls. It disappears when no one is willing to see them. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, please like this video, share it, and subscribe to Service Honor Stories so that none of their memories are forgotten. Service Honor Stories. We remember the quiet heroes,